Two family histories linked by one Nazi atrocity: forced labor.
My grandmother always said that she, her mother, and her two brothers were sold for 8 or 10 Reichsmarks.
It has to be said, forced labor was the most public, large-scale atrocity under National Socialism.
80 years later, the history of many families during World War II is still hidden under a veil of silence.
No one wants to be the Nazi, to say, yeah, my family did terrible things.
How do grandchildren and great-grandchildren of murderers and victims fight against the desire to forget?
He's practically a child still if you look at him. Just 16. Terrible.
Stefan Weger is reading the court file of Walerian Wróbel, a Polish forced laborer. He was a minor when he was executed in 1942 under the brutal Nazi German Penal Code. Walerian's story is part of Stefan's family history. It was the testimony of his great-grandmother Luise, a farmer's daughter from Bremen, who helped seal the boy's fate.
To look this boy in the face and then testify against him to the police, knowing what can happen to him, what was done to such people in the so-called Third Reich, that's a serious thing.
7 years ago, the photographer began exploring the role of his great-grandmother Luise in the case of Walerian Wróbel. He first heard about it in school, and he's never forgotten it.
I came home all upset about it, and my mom just said to me, "You know that it was Luise, right? Luise, my great-grandmother, who was very elderly at the time. How could this little frail woman have played a part in that boy's execution?"
This place holds the answer, a property on the outskirts of the North German city of Bremen, today a nature reserve.
This is one of the last parts of the farm that's still standing.
Now aged 35, Stefan Weger has kept coming to photograph the place where his great-grandmother once lived. He's released a photo book called Luise, Archaeology of an Injustice. Walerian Wróbel came to the farm in 1941. The Nazis had forcibly taken him from German-occupied Poland for forced labor. The 16-year-old was to work on the farm. The German family were not happy with him. The boy was lazy, they said, and his German poor. After a few days, Walerian tried unsuccessfully to escape. Then a fire broke out in the barn. The police said the boy had started the fire on purpose. They claimed he almost burned down the farm.
It was a twofold injustice. Firstly, that Walerian was brought here as a forced laborer at all. Forced labor is a form of modern slavery. And the second injustice is, it seems that he was terribly homesick, and in his naivety, he apparently started a small fire in the hope that he would be sent home again. But it was actually for this deed, which left only minimal damage, that he was executed.
Photos show only small burn marks. And although Walerian helped to extinguish the fire, the statements given by Luise and her mother weighed against him. He spent 9 months in a concentration camp, and then, in August 1942, he was beheaded.
The case of Luise shows how easy it was to become complicit. In this case, it would have had no consequences at all if the family had just said, it was an accident, 2 candles were knocked over, or whatever. So many people had the opportunity to help, or at least to not make things worse, but they didn't take it.
The Nazis operated an entire system of forced labor. Starting in 1933, the National Socialists began arresting political opponents, Jews, Sinti, and Roma, homosexuals, and other persecuted groups, consigning them to do forced labor. The invasion of Poland in 1939, triggering the start of World War II, marked the next stage of that system. First came the armed forces, then the Nazi bureaucracy. It affected everyone who was able to work. The Nazis viewed occupied lands as a reservoir of workers. Alongside prisoners of war, they also rounded up civilians for the German Reich, men, women, and children from all over Europe. Around 8.4 million civilians were forced to work for the war effort, industry, and agriculture, or in small businesses and private households.
It has to be said, forced labor was the most public, large-scale atrocity under National Socialism at the time. Everyone encountered forced laborers, as neighbors, as work colleagues, whatever. So you couldn't be ignorant of what was happening. And most Germans were happy to benefit from their work.
Sieczkowski is heading to the village of Wążyn, a 2-hour drive south of Gdansk in the heart of Poland. This is where his grandmother Felicia once lived. In 1940, she was taken by the Nazis, together with her mother and brothers, to work in what was then German territory. She was 27.
I suspect that my grandmother had all kinds of feelings, but above all, I'm sure she was afraid. I don't think anyone who has grown up in times of peace and relative prosperity today can really imagine what it was like. Life as she knew it suddenly came to an abrupt end. Everything changed in the blink of an eye, and she found herself in a completely new reality.
Today, Dania's cousin, Mateusz Sieczkowski, lives in the house. Their grandmother rarely talked about what she'd experienced.
They were transported to the vicinity of Kołobrzeg. Grandma said they were sold there at the market, like slaves. She always mentioned that she, her mother, and her 2 brothers were sold for 8 or 10 Reichsmarks. I didn't know that. No one told me. Like I said, Grandma never wanted to talk about it.
Dania asked his grandmother about it repeatedly. Over the years, he was able to put together the fragments that she told him. Felicia was forced to work on a German farm for 5 years.
Grandma had quite positive memories of the farmer. There were no insults. She was never beaten or called a Polish pig. Other forced laborers were less fortunate.
In 1945, when the war ended, she was free to leave and returned to this farm in Poland. Later, she moved to the Gdansk area. The 43-year-old Daniel is visiting the cemetery in Wążyn. He still has many unanswered questions that he was never able to ask his grandmother. It's the same for many other descendants of Poland's war generation.
You know, after the war, very few people wanted to keep carrying these stories around with them.
Back to Bremen. The district court now has a memorial plaque commemorating Valerian Wrubel. Under the Nazi dictatorship, a special court convened here. Valerian was convicted as a Volksschädling, a term used by the Nazis to mean a harmful pest or parasite. With his photo book, Stefan Weger wanted to show how the system was helped by many accomplices and work through a chapter of his own family history at the same time.
Everyone agrees it's important to work through this history, but no one wants to be the Nazi, to say, yes, my family did terrible things. But that's a misunderstanding. It's by talking about what my ancestors did that I don't go on to do the same.
In this courtroom, his great-grandmother Luise repeated her testimony. During the trial, she probably saw Valerian for the first time since his arrest, in the dock, marked by 9 months of hard labor in a concentration camp.
Of course, you always imagine, wouldn't it be a cathartic end to the story if you could sit here with her now, and she would regret everything, and cry and say, oh, it was all so terrible, and thought, what have we done? And shouldn't we have protected him? Of course, that's what you always want.
In Poland, Daniel Sieczkowski is also keen to find out more. As a historian, he has spent years studying the history of forced labor in the Second World War. His institute in Gdansk manages historical documents on crimes committed against Polish citizens during that period. People from all over Poland come here to learn more about the fate of their relatives. Today, Daniel is submitting an application himself. He wants to know if the archives can reveal more about his grandmother Felicia.
Grandma talked to very few people about her story. You had to ask her specifically. She didn't just tell you, as if she thought these things belonged to a past that she didn't want to revisit.
Like Felicia, Most Polish survivors of forced labor spoke little about their experience. After the war ended, they returned to a deeply traumatized society where there was no place for their suffering. The Second World War killed around 6 million Poles, more than a sixth of the population. The vast majority were civilians. Many cities and villages were destroyed. After the war ended, there was initially no compensation from Germany for the Polish victims of forced labor.
In the post-war period, civilian forced laborers were not recognized as true victims of Nazism. The deportations and forced labor were seen as a kind of side effect of the war.
It wasn't until the early 1990s that Germany gave more official recognition to civilian forced laborers. Almost 60 years after the war ended, the Polish victims received a one-off payment equal to around 500 to 2,500 euros.
Of course, many were not satisfied with the level of compensation, but for many it was still a really important symbolic gesture.
The Museum of Forced Labor in the city of Weimar has become another place of remembrance in Germany for this chapter of Nazi history. In a special exhibition, Stefan Weger is showing the pictures of his great-grandmother. The museum offers workshops on researching family history in the Nazi era. 80 years after the war ended, such programs are in demand in Germany. Many want to research their own family history, as Stefan Weger has done.
The generational gap is greater now, and that gives us a whole new opportunity to really get to grips with that generation without prejudice. There's hardly anyone left alive from that time who could make young people aware of what happened. If it's no longer talked about in families, then schools or an institute like ours won't be able to fill that gap. I think for us today, it's incredibly important to think about what is our historical responsibility and how can we ensure that these things never happen again.